health and wellbeing among our first wave of the survey was about 40,000 young people across Greater Manchester.
Progress.
30-second nutshell is basically collecting that data to be used for assessment and monitoring purposes, to then feed back to schools and other providers so that there is good quality evidence on which to base action. So we feed the data back to schools, but we also feed it back to communities and service providers and so on, to give them an evidence base on which to act. And that data that we've gathered has already reinforced the evidence around the major inequalities that we see in terms of young people's mental health. So just to give you an example, one of the things that we look at in Be Well is young people's gender identity and their sexuality, and we see huge inequalities there. So young people who are, for example, who are non-binary, who don't necessarily align themselves to either of the kind of traditional genders, are 5 times more likely to experience significant mental health problems than their peers. Similarly, just in terms of that traditional gender split, about over 1 in 5 girls in our sample, 40,000, experienced what we would term clinically significant levels of mental health problems, compared to only 7% of boys. So there's major gaps in different social strata there. So this to me speaks to the need for a more inclusive climate. It speaks to the need for the importance of relationships and sex education and really getting that right. We tend to think of ourselves as a fairly progressive society, but clearly that's at odds with what a lot of young people are telling us. But we also need to address what we call the causes of the causes. So there are structural inequalities in our society that prevent young people from thriving, that mean that their background or their characteristics are a barrier to them experiencing good levels of well-being and thriving. So we need to address those. Coming on to the role of the school, I'm kind of thinking about what is the role of the school in all of this. Clearly, it's an important developmental context for young people. And for me, the role of school in terms of what can be done to support wellbeing splits into kind of 4 areas with an acronym called RISE. So schools can be a useful source of referral to specialist services, whether that's CAMS or whether that's independent service providers like Place to Be and like Cooth. They can identify, assess and monitor, which is where our Be Well programme comes in. They can provide support, so they can actually provide intervention and support within schools to support young people's wellbeing. And we've done a lot of research in the Education Department of Manchester looking at what actually works to promote mental health and wellbeing in school. And they can also provide an environment, so the final one, the E in RISE is environment, an environment in which young people feel safe and in which young people feel happy. And that's particularly important for young people who come from more challenging, disadvantaged backgrounds, where their home environment, which is also a place we want them to be safe and happy, there are young people whose lives aren't like that. And so school becomes even more important as a safe environment. So I'm going to focus a little bit on identification, assessment and monitoring. You'll have seen from the briefing pack for this event today, the evidence around the onset of mental health difficulties. Half of all lifetime cases are first onset by age 14. Most lifetime cases of mental health difficulties have first onset by age 18. So basically, the school years are when we're likely to see the emergence of mental health difficulties among most people that will ever experience them. And this is where then the need for high quality data becomes really important. So schools need support in this area. There's a piece of work done on behalf of the Department of Education about 4 years ago that surveyed schools about their provision. Less than half of schools collect data of any type in relation to mental health and wellbeing. And of those that do, very few use standardized validated measures. So schools need support to use the right tools to get the right data to enable them to think about where resources are best placed. Scarce resources isn't, we're always going to be dealing with a situation that's far from ideal in terms of the amount of resource that's available. So where it's placed becomes all the more important. So the Be Well study, as I said, this has been about turning data into action, which hopefully we've done a good proof of concept of in Greater Manchester. And I encourage colleagues to go on the GM Well website and look at the incredible work that the service providers, the schools and the other allied professions are doing in Greater Manchester in response to the data that we've collected. But we can also talk about the potential for universal screening. If we want to identify children and young people before problems become deeply embedded, then we need to be thinking about screening. And the logic here is that the cost of the investment in screening approaches, which again are rarely used in schools for mental health, That pays for itself if you identify young people before problems escalate and become deeply embedded and resistant to intervention. The government are currently consulting on a national behaviour and wellbeing monitoring survey, which is a really promising sign, but the thing I can't emphasise enough is producing the data alone is not enough. Schools and the other agencies and organisations that are there to support young people's wellbeing need support to interpret anatomy. So this needs to be wide scale, needs to be standardised, needs to be supported, and it's not just schools as well. So mostly we're here to talk about the role of schools and colleges and universities, but it's everybody's business. So I want to finish with my key ask. We need investment in young people's wellbeing in childhood and adolescence to better manage. So it's all about early prevention for me. There's been increased investment to grow the mental health support teams, but it's a drop in the ocean. We need investment in prevention in addition to treatment. We need the spend per child to go up. So there's a great report by the Centre for Mental Health that came out last year. The spend per child is a postcode lottery in the UK, but it goes as low as £14 per child. The average spend on adult mental health is £225. That's completely the wrong way around. So we need a national identification, assessment and monitoring system. We need better support for teachers and school staff, so they need to be trained, equipped and supported to do this kind of work. It needs to begin with initial training, which Ola mentioned, but there needs to be continued professional development, supervision, staff in schools that are doing mental health work. We wouldn't dream of having a mental health professional who does, say, counselling in schools to not have supervision in place, and yet teachers are doing mental health work routinely, quite often without that kind of supervision work that enables them to kind of work through the emotional impact on themselves. We need to think about how integrated care systems, for example, might be a useful vehicle for having a much more integrated support system for young people's wellbeing. And all of the above, as I said, is in service of early intervention. So the fact that we're still having to push this agenda and bang this drum more than a decade on from Graham Allen MP's report on early intervention, which made waves in 2011, the fact that we're still having to talk about the need for early intervention is of concern to me. And I will leave it there.
Thank you very much indeed, Neil. I think your ask was about 16 asks.
Sorry.
But all of them very important. And I'm going to move straight on because I am very keen to make time for the whole group to be able to participate in the discussion. I'm going to move straight on to Margarita Panayiotou, who I think, again, is going to talk about school culture, and that's something that both Ola and Neil have been touching on in terms of the student experience and what they report back. And I think too, you've been saying about social media, which I know will be of huge interest to parliamentarians, particularly as we're working towards the whatever it's called, online safety, online harms legislation.
Yeah, that's right. Hi everyone, good to be here. I will touch on some things that Ola and Neil discussed, but my work is around social media and the impact that may have on mental health in children and young people, but also how we assess social media. How do we measure social media? Obviously, there's an ongoing debate that doesn't stop. It's just there's two schools of thought currently, where some researchers think that it's the one factor that impacts mental health negatively. There's people that look at it the other way, and it's very easy to say that is the one reason behind poor mental health. That would have made our job very easy, but obviously it would be unfair to the young child or the young person to think that there's only one reason that is behind any difficulties. So there is a huge complexity around social media, and there is ongoing evidence that shows that that complexity exists, and that varies by age, it varies by gender, and there's recent evidence to support that. We wanted to take that complexity into account in our work and think of social media around other issues of young people's life. And so we did an analysis with the Understanding Society sample, which is approximately 12,000 young people. And we found that across time, social media was the least influential factor in their general life and mental health. And we actually found that for both boys and girls, family support was the most influential factor, positive. So we can see that there's a lot of complexity happening in their own life, and we sort of overlook that when we're talking about social media. One of the key issues, though, with our work and with general research in social media is how we define and how we measure social media. Usually and typically within large cohort studies, which tend to be the representative samples, we use the time spent on social media. So how much time, how many hours a day do young people spend on social media? And then we use that to understand whether it has an impact on their life. I mean, everyone can understand that this is just a very simplistic way that we measure social media. It has so many aspects, and there's so many ways in which a young person can engage in social media. And so that's an unfair way of looking at it. And so we need to start looking at the ways in which young people engage with social media. We need to start looking at specific factors that may be influencing mental health negatively and what aspects can help and promote well-being. And we looked at a study during the first lockdown with adolescents aged 16 to 24. And we saw that young people that use social media to engage with family and friends during the first lockdown reported better mental health. And that was also the case when they used social media in an active way, when they were participating, when they were posting, and they were not engaging with it passively. And so when we start looking at specific ways in which one engages, we can see that there's some nuanced differences in the mental health of young people. And so, well, the huge ask would be, obviously we want to do something about mental health, and we want to do something about social media. It's a key factor influencing negatively mental health. But we need to first understand social media. We need to understand how it influences mental health before offering some solutions to it. And that has been discussed in the green paper on internet safety. Current research is quite limited because of the way we assess social media. So we need to engage with young people, which is not often done when we are developing measures, when we're trying to assess some factors. We need to engage with young people and understand how are they using it. We need to hear from them and then provide better measurement. Either that is through smartphone applications or self-report measurements, is what Neil was saying about assessment. First, we need to understand what social media is, how it influences, and then having done that first step, another key aspect would be to roll out a digital citizenship curriculum in all schools that focuses not only on teaching staff and students how to use social media effectively, how to regulate when there are difficulties using social media, but also we need to engage with parents. So we need to make sure that there is a collaboration between the key aspects of a young person's life on social media and understand how we can capitalize on the benefits of social media. And there are some charities like ChildNet and organizations that work with young people and parents and develop some guidance on how to use that effectively. So yeah, but before we do that, we need to first understand exactly what is happening and hear from them instead of just doing analysis on our own without involving them.
Thank you very much indeed, Margaret. It was really, really interesting and very timely, as I say, as we're thinking very actively about this in Parliament now. It hasn't escaped my notice that all three of the academics have reinforced my perception of academics kiosk as invariably being more research is needed. And that comes as no surprise to me at all, but I think it really is. Two things have happened since we started the meeting. One is Rosanna has joined us, and I'll ask Rosanna to speak in a few moments, but I see we've also gone online, and I wonder if that means we've got Kathy with us. Well, my assertion for great. So I'll introduce then our final academic speaker. That gives me great pleasure, Kathy. Thank you for joining us. Kathy Atkinson, who I think is particularly going to talk to us about issues around play, and will give us an additional dimension to the discussion we're having this morning.
Thank you so much, and thank you very much indeed for accommodating me. I'm so sorry I couldn't join you in person. I tested positive with COVID yesterday, unfortunately. So I work on the initial training programme for educational psychologists at the University of Manchester, and I'm also a practitioner educational psychologist. So 2 days of my week are actually spent working in schools. In relation to children's play, The right to play, leisure and recreation is actually Article 31 of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. However, because it was overlooked, the right to play was somewhat overlooked in relation to the general document. In 2013, the UNCRC actually published General Comment 17, and the reason for that was to enable a much greater understanding of the fundamental benefits of play in relation to children's development, their learning, and essentially to their well-being. So General Comment 17 not only talks about the importance of play, it also talks about groups that are vulnerable to not being able to access their play rights, and they include children living in poverty, they include children from minority groups, but it also talks about children living in situations where there's been a humanitarian or natural disaster. Now, obviously the COVID-19 situation isn't a complete match for that, but I'm sure we can see the parallels, and what that document talks about is how play can provide opportunities for recovery from those difficult times. It also talks, General Comment 17, about the role that schools can play in helping children achieve their play rights, especially for those marginalised children. However, what we know and what I see as a practitioner is that schools are under enormous pressure to deliver academic outcomes and also to accelerate learning post-pandemic. And even pre-pandemic, in fact, research indicates that school break time and play time, even for the youngest children, has been cut significantly. So over the course of the week, for the very youngest children, that amounts to about 45 minutes. And for older children, secondary age children, who we also know that play is vitally important to, it was up to about 65 minutes within the last 25 years. There is extensive evidence which talks about the role of play in promoting children's psychological and mental health, and obviously that's notwithstanding the physical benefits of play. And the excuse me, the COVID crisis has highlighted the critical importance on play on children's lives. I'm sure none of us have been untouched by what we've seen in the restrictions placed on children's play and social opportunities, and we're really only beginning to understand the impact of that in relation to children's mental health and well-being. But what we know is that play can play a really key part in the recovery curriculum for children and young people of all ages. So I'll be pretty brief, but for my key ask would be that for this to happen, policymakers need to understand the instrumental benefit and the centrality of play in promoting children's development, learning, and well-being and mental health. They need to be able to communicate this to schools so that curriculum planning, the planning of a school day, can accommodate the children's right to play, and also the centrality of that in terms of their healthy development. And in terms of, again, thinking preventatively, schools need to work with parents so that play is not just understood as something frivolous, as a reward, as some downtime. It's seen as both a right and a fundamental need to healthy children's development. Thank you.
So much, Kathy. Really interesting concluding presentation from our academic colleagues, emphasising the importance of play. And I think we have had some common themes from the four of you around needing to know what the situation is and gathering data, around resources and making sure that staff are properly equipped and trained to deliver the necessary wellbeing and mental health support in education settings. The importance of family and family relationships has come up quite a few times, and all of this, I think, brigaded together in a context of reducing inequalities and the impact that inequalities are already having on children's mental health and well-being and those different dimensions you've been talking about. Rosanna, I know you haven't heard all the presentations that we've had, but I also know that this is something you think about and care about all the time. And so we've got now a few minutes for Rosanna's reflections, and then I'm going to open it up to the whole group for comments and questions from everyone in the room. Rosanna, I'm really pleased you're here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And it's just so lovely to see so many friends in the room. I know so many of you work so hard devoting your entire lives to this aim and purpose. And you know, sorry I can't join you for the entirety because we have health questions today and many other things, but I have had the honour of working with Kate on the issue of mental health and children's mental health for the last couple of years, and she's absolutely superb. So thank you so much for inviting me. I feel as though whenever I come to meetings like this, I'm really inspired, and when I hear speakers, I think I want to take notes as a parent, as a doctor, and as somebody who has the brief for mental health for the Labour Party. I feel like I always learn so much on many levels, and there's probably not a lot I can tell you that you don't already know. But what I thought I would do is reflect on some of the common themes that I see in my role as a parliamentarian in terms of drivers behind mental ill health, talk a little bit about what I see as a doctor as well. And I wanted to touch, because obviously we have a focus on a region today, you know, touch on the real issues of the postcode lottery that you're going to be experiencing in Manchester and Trafford area as well. So just on a basic level, just as a clinician, having been an A&E doctor working in paediatrics and adults for the last 15 years, what I'm seeing coming in every time I do a shift, and my last shift was just 2 days ago, I'm seeing children coming in younger and younger with eating disorders, feeling incredibly stressed, not knowing how to manage, talking about taking their own lives, commonly talking about the difficulty that they've had in accessing the help and support that they need. That's often coming from their parents, actually, who are tearing their hair out. And just listening, you know, to the issue of play, that is so remarkable to me, that over the recent, you know, years, is something so essential has been sort of cut out of children's development. And some of the common themes that I'm hearing are pressure at school. The fact that my 7-year-old had SATs was just quite beyond me. I found myself pressured as a parent and piling the pressure onto her. And I'm someone that's in the know about how these things work. And also, we know that adverse childhood experiences are the single biggest driver of mental ill health later on. And unfortunately, over the years, we've just seen that get worse and worse and worse. Insecure housing, lack of access for parents having jobs, all of these things that are across our society go towards building a mentally unhealthier community for our children. So we almost have a two-pronged approach, really. A difficulty in accessing help when you need it, and more drivers that cause the stress in the first place. And there is a mental health crisis that is affecting young people, and it's shocking to see that 96% of children feel that mental health issues affect their schoolwork. Because essentially, if we don't get it right, we're letting down an entire generation. And also, we all know as well, it's a false economy not to invest in children's mental health. Because if anyone has experience of someone that they love or care about suffering with mental health at home, you know that for parents that can't get quick and timely access, if your child is self-harming, if your child is talking about taking their own lives, you give up work. You give up work to be at home. You don't know what to do, where to turn to. And I have parents that I see in the A&E just saying, we've been waiting 2 years to be seen, we just don't know what to do anymore. So they give up work. So the young person's impacted, their parents are impacted, and then siblings become impacted. So just not investing in one young person's mental health has a knock-on impact to 4 or 5 people at least in the home. That's why, as a politician, and people might say, well, you know, what are you going to do about it? Well, that's why it's been so good to work with so many of you, and it's great to see a place to be here. I know that you do so much in schools, but it's so important to understand that prevention and working cross-departmentally is the only way we're really going to create change. If we can address the issues that are driving poor mental health in our children, firstly. But secondly, it's the quick and timely treatment and help, and not this languishing on waiting lists for forever, if you actually end up on the waiting list. So we know that it's a real postcode lottery of cases being closed. You can live in one borough and find that your referral goes through, and you can live in another borough just 2 roads over and find that your case is closed before you're even seen. Now, for the parents that I meet, both in my role as a politician and as a doctor, whose case has been closed, it's loss of hope. They don't know where to go anymore. And so it's about saying, well, look, let's look at schools. So we've pledged that we would have a counsellor for every school. So there'd be a counsellor in every secondary school and counsellor provision, because some primary schools are small, it doesn't need just one person. So one counsellor to maybe serve 2 or 3 schools. We'd also have open access mental health hubs in the community. Not everybody can go to their parents or their teachers. We need to make it easy for people to access the mental health support that they need. We've also said, and this is big, and people always say there's a problem, then you come up with a solution, they go, that's impossible. But we have said that over the course of the first Parliament, what we would aim to do is to recruit 8,500 new mental health staff members to ensure that people can receive treatment within a month. That sounds so ambitious, but I think we have to be ambitious. If we're not, it's bleak. The future is bleak. And that's why it's just so fantastic to have initiatives like Be Well, because they're so incredibly important. They're so reliably informed. And actually, if we didn't have initiatives like Be Well, if we didn't have Place to Be, if we didn't have other organisations, the Mental Health Foundations here, if we didn't have people trying to prop up the system almost, we would be even worse off than we already are. Now, just wanting to talk just a little bit, I don't want to take up too much time, but obviously we're talking about levelling up. So for me, when I think about that, it's the real postcode lottery of provision that comes to mind. And I'm just going to tell you some stats, right? It isn't just about whether your case is closed or not. It's on the priority when it comes to spending. So, Trafford CCG spends 11% of its funding on mental health, which is the lowest in the country. Manchester CCG spends 16.5% on mental health, which is in comparison to West London CCG, which spends 22% on mental health. We've got to make the case that every child, every person across the country deserves the same. It cannot be a postcode lottery dependent on where you live. That's just frankly wrong. On waiting times, in Trafford CCG, 69% of young people referred for mental health services wait longer than 4 weeks for treatment. And in Manchester CCG, this figure is 78%. 78%, it's like 4 and 5. This is in comparison to just 35% in Tower Hamlets CCG. And in Trafford, 22% of mental health referrals for young people are closed before treatment. And in Manchester, this figure is 14%. And I know normally people's eyes glaze over when you sort of read stats, but these stats are so stark and highlight the real crisis that we're in, and how absolutely, if we don't keep fighting politically and trying to work cross party, because I think everyone can agree that this shouldn't be a political football. The mental health of our children shouldn't be a political football. There should be cross party agreement on it and a will to deliver more. But I represent the Labour Party, and I can tell you that we're keeping on pushing. And it is with yourselves and incredible colleagues like Kate Green that I believe we will get there, but we've got a fight on our hands. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rosanna. Thanks ever so much for coming in and contributing your thoughts on some really shocking statistics actually about variation across the country. And we've got quite a bit of time, probably about half an hour now, a little over for people's comments, questions, sharing of experiences and practices in your own areas. So I'm going to open it up for anyone who wants to say anything, but I will just allow any parliamentarian colleagues who want to chip in first, because I know quite often you've got to run away and do something else. On the other hand, if you're not quick to nip in, I'll just open it up to the whole room.
Kate, just one.
And if you wouldn't mind introducing yourselves as well.
Sorry, I'm.
Because I may know who you are, but others may not.
Indeed, I'm Claire Tyler. I'm a Lib Dem here, and I sort of lead for the Lib Dems on mental health in the Lords. One thing that I've been thinking about, long and hard in the last few years, is why it is that we have what feels like almost like an epidemic of children's mental health problems. And round and round in my head goes the sort of the questions. Is it because of sort of new and different pressures? And we have heard some of those in relatively new social media and things like that. Is it because people are actually more willing to talk about these things and acknowledge these things than in the past? Or has something sort of happened which sort of accounts for what feels to me like an absolute step change in the number of children who are affected? And when I think of all the sort of things that we talk about individually, they don't, to me, sort of quite feel enough to account for it. And I know within my own family and sort of wider circle, I feel so sort of distressed about the number of my sort of immediate sort of family members and wider family members where the children and young people have got serious eating disorders, self-harming, you know, attempted to take their own lives and things like that. And it just feels to me that something's happened and I just don't know what it is, actually, to account for
all
it.
of the above.
Yeah.
I don't know if one of the researchers in the room wants to just pick that up.
I think we probably say very similar things, which is all of the above. I think there's such a keenness, I think, often to find like a silver bullet, and often mental health, social media, sorry, is talked about in that way. And I think actually the kind of work we've done and colleagues have done is the reality of it is that it's all of those things. So like school definitely seems, the pressure in school seems to have increased, but pressures from other, you know, globalization means people are engaging with a much wider range of input almost. And there's all of that side of things. There's maybe social media, but we don't really know. There's definitely kind of shifts in inequalities and how those continue to change. And yeah, I think it's always one of those things where like it's probably a bunch of stuff all put together, which makes it difficult to disentangle. I don't know if either of you.
Yeah, I was going to say, when you think about the development of a child, the factors that go into the development of a child is so many. And so when we're thinking about what can contribute to mental health, then again, it's many things altogether. And with that family support, peer support as well comes up a lot. Definitely social media will have some aspects of it that are harmful, but is unfortunately not just one thing, probably it's many things together.
I mean, you could respond to that by saying, well, what you need is a holistic strategy for children and young people's well-being and mental health, which doesn't start with this is a mental health question, but actually starts with this is a social question in every aspect of children's lives. That's probably bigger than the government's currently thinking of in terms of its plans for a 10-year mental health strategy. But it also makes me wonder if perhaps that begs the question, are we really sufficiently child-focused now in the way in which we approach policy making? Kathy or Neil, I don't know if either of you want to add anything.
Yeah, I mean, we did some research which actually looked at some of the measures that Neil was talking about in terms of kind of mental health difficulties, but also mapped that against kind of self-reported emotional needs. Now, obviously it was talking about needs in its broadest sense, but things like the need to feel in control, the need to feel safe, the need to feel competent. And what we found was that there was a really strong correlation between children that didn't feel those needs were being met for whatever reason and the reported emotional distress. And what we also found is things like, I mean, it was a fairly small scale study, it was only about 1,000 students, but amongst those students there seemed to be an acceleration of distress towards the end of the secondary career. So for example, the need to feel competent, the need for feeling control, those needs were very much underreported as a distress included. And I suppose that would resonate with things like, you know, exam stress, what am I going to do once I leave school? So I think although we can't necessarily understand that the different dimensions that would impact on children, we can understand what they need. They need to feel safe, they need to feel competent, they need to feel challenged, they need to feel that they've got friends. All of these needs we can profile against and if we understand which needs aren't being met, then we can think about how potentially schools can and teachers can support in addressing those gaps.
No, I just asked a question, so
Yeah.
go to it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything colleagues have said so far. I think the thing for me about the question about what's changed and the answer kind of being all of the above, if you look at what all of those different things, the kind of commonality, it's about the stress and the pressure that young people experience, whether it's in relation to certain aspects of social media, you know, notwithstanding the fact that, you know, it's bound to be a mixed bag and some elements of social media activity are going to be useful for young people's well-being, but there'll be elements of that that are placing pressure on people, girls in particular, the stress and pressure faced in schools that, you know, as a parent, I'm a parent of 3 children, my eldest child in primary school, the only times The only time that I saw her distressed, she went to a great primary school, but year 6 was a nightmare. Year 6 was a nightmare because of the pressure of SAMs. And that's with a great supportive school that tried to kind of minimize and mitigate the pressure, but the pressure on young people experienced in school is immense. The stuff around play would things are changing in terms of what it means to be a child and to experience childhood, and we're eroding with the reduction in play and with the increased pressure. We're eroding the kind of freedom and autonomy and exploration that happens in childhood that's so fundamentally important for well-being. So the commonality, I think, is around that stress and that pressure that young people experience. And that's where that kind of whole system response that needs to start to address that. We need childhood and adolescence to kind of, we need to dial it back to, you know, rose-tinted glasses. I grew up in the 80s and 90s when you were out playing. You know, it was a very different time to be a child and young person. And, you know, it's very easy to say things were better back in my day, but genuinely, you know, there are some fundamental shifts that have occurred that are worrying, and we need to kind of almost think back to, well, what can we do to kind of put some of those things back in place?
I mean, I really liked your point, Kathy, about autonomy. I don't think we talk about that nearly enough in relation to adults, let alone children and young people. And I know how important it is to me to feel in control of my own life and my own way. It's really, and I think that was a really interesting point. Just to push back on you, Neil, I was going to say exactly what you just said, actually. I don't think things were better or less pressured. You know, if I look at my parents' upbringing in the 1930s, they faced the pressure of appalling poverty. They faced the pressure of expectations in a family where worklessness was their biggest fear. I think girls faced all sorts of pressures in terms of their options were very limited. I think the pressures are different. I question whether they're greater. They may be more visible and in media, so social media being a good example. And I'm also just, you and Rosanna, and I think possibly Ola as well mentioned SATs, but there is some countering research, isn't there, which I've seen quite recently, which says that kids are not too bothered about SATs, but their parents may be experiencing a pressure and transmitting it, but kids themselves just accept it as one more thing going on in the school day. I can't remember who did that research. I read it a few months ago, and I thought it actually opened up a whole lot of questions for me. We'll go to John next, because I know you were waving a few minutes ago. Peter, you all. Thank you ever so much for coming. Yeah, thanks very much.
Yes, really fascinating.
I'll go to John and then to Rosanna.
Well, first of all, thank you for bringing this together. Really interesting. I'm John Woodcock. I was a Labour Member of Parliament in Northwest in Ballinfurnace with Kate and Rosanna for until the last election. Now crossbench here in the Lords. Two quick questions, if I can. Just on that issue, and Neil, you mentioned the pressures on your kids. Now, this is anecdotal from my kids, but I wonder, my observation is, anecdotally, is that, I mean, one, the obvious thing that my kids really suffered in the lockdown. First time I've become properly worried about them. But then the question is, I don't think their social life, certainly not the younger one who's 10, their face-to-face social life has bounced back quite to pre-pandemic levels, and that's a worry because, you know, there is still that level of isolation. I wonder, I can see Peter nodding there, so that's interesting. The main question I was going to ask was on devolution and Greater Manchester Settlement, and it's great that you have brought this together when you're focused on it in the Greater Manchester context and you bring it down here. So reflections around the table, around the room about how you feel the ecosystem is in Greater Manchester. Is it moving in the right direction? Is devolution of healthcare, is that a positive for you? Where the challenges are? Rosanna's figures really stark on the difference in the amount of investment. Of course, one person's postcode lottery is another's entirely uniform standards, which means no devolution to Manchester or anywhere else. And so how you ensure that actually being able to make decisions within the region, which by definition mean a difference to national policy, how you make sure that is a positive thing, and if you're already seeing that coming through.
It's really, really interesting question. I know you touched on thinking about the role of the ICS, which we're just about to see take off in Greater Manchester next month. I think it's due to launch, isn't it? Neil, I don't know if you want to pick that,
Yeah,
that devolution point.
So there's I think the ecosystem in Greater Manchester, aided by the devolution of the healthcare system, there's a spirit of collaboration that's been enabled between health and education. There's a historical kind of disconnect between education and health that's been, academics have been looking for years and that's been part of policy. But just to give you one example of the kind of work that, would it have been possible without devolution of Greater Manchester? Who knows? But it happened as a result of that. Is the Health and Social Care Partnership, who working on a new crisis care system for children and young people, which was blown out of the water, unfortunately, by the pandemic, as many things were, but actually commissioning the third sector to pick up some of the crisis care work. So it's working in ways that are much more flexible. So having that autonomy through devolution enables, I think, greater collaboration with other sectors, but it also enables greater autonomy to be more creative in making use of the response that we have, including collaboration with the third sector to provide services that are free from I was going to say straitjacket, but that's not the right analogy. But basically, there are restrictions, that are kind of loosened when you have devolution. So it enables greater creativity almost with the way that we organise services for children and young people. And post-pandemic now, your own observations about kind of things not getting back to pre-pandemic levels, my observations are absolutely the same. And I think actually it goes beyond children and young people. I think it's changed, things are kind of, in quotes, back to normal, but they're not. I mean, we all behave and interact differently than we did pre-pandemic. So I think particularly children and people, my observation is exactly the same.
Yeah, thank you.
It's really interesting. Yes.
Hi, Catherine, our place to be. So working with over 100 schools directly with teams embedded in Greater Manchester. Agree with so much of all the points that we've heard. I think I pull us back to, in thinking about what we want for children and young people. I start with well-being and the difference between, before we dive into mental health problems, we want well-being for our children. And we set that as the benchmark that we're trying to achieve. And then start to step down into how do we prevent, and I think the importance of, Neil said, intervening early primary schools. So I'd have to encourage Rosanna to be even more ambitious in plans, not just a counsellor in every secondary school, which would be a good thing, but primary schools, so that we can get in. And then really, I would urge us to systematically look at implementation of the whole school approach, which is the training, which starts with the school leadership. And we've got some of the elements of these underway with the green paper and all of that, but it's quite disjointed and mixed. So we need the school leadership to be on board and to understand the whole school approach. We need teacher training, so teachers are properly equipped. And there are cost-effective ways of doing that. We can use digital and online to do that. We need parenting and parenting support, and then we need targeted support. And that's where I think within Greater Manchester and Salford specifically, we've got some great joint commissioning and a blended model with the mental health support teams, plus the voluntary sector and other partners, because the light touch of the mental health support teams, it's a start, but it's just not enough. And there's still a great chasm and gap between what the mental health support teams can reach and specialist CAMs. So they're a good start. We need to build on it, and I would urge with a blended model.
That's really great. Thank you very much. Right, I mean, loads of answers. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'll forget which one I said, so you wouldn't mind remembering. And don't cheat if you weren't one of my first 5. Yes.
Hi, everyone. Mark Bowden from Mental Health Foundation, Chief Executive, and thanks very much for all of the presentations. I just wanted to build on a few things, because I think just to come to Catherine's point about the whole school approach, I think that's really important. I think that strategic approach is important. There are a couple of things I just wanted to say from our work that we've seen as well. I wanted to come to Baroness Tyler's, the why question. I think this sense of increasing alienation, different experiences of life, corresponding with a window to everyone's world, are two things that is genuinely new. So we've got widening inequalities, more emotional distress, and seeing the different comparisons, and we're deeply comparative creatures. So I think that is new, but I wouldn't underestimate what you said, Kate, that trauma has been pushed down and unarticulated and unexpressed for many, many generations. So I think we're seeing the true picture come through. A couple of things that we've just seen in our work in schools is the power of peer support. If we're going to take on this question of comparative influence on our well-being and mental health, we run programs where year 11s with year 7. So it's that solidarity of experience, understanding what's coming, equipping people, getting around the teachers being poacher and gamekeeper, and letting the kids teach the kids, letting them be the experts, and that intergeneration. I think that's really key, and I think Manchester could play a really key role in that. And the other thing I wanted to land on the time that Manchester could be a trailblazer for, if talking about prevention in schools, the single biggest thing we could do to prevent poor mental health in schools is comprehensive anti-bullying programs that are of a high standard, very well evidenced. The return on investment is absolutely huge, and I don't hear enough of that. I think coming back to some of those really important components is going to be really important. I think it'd be great to see Manchester make a real big commitment ahead of the national picture, and then reap some of the benefits.
Thank you very much. It's just your work.
Hi, I'm Lucy Circle. I'm the Professor of Psychology of Eating Disorders at UCL, and I also am the clinical lead for an eating disorder service, lifespan eating disorder service in North East London. So we work with both young people and adults with eating disorders. And I wanted to make a couple of points about eating disorders. During the pandemic, massive increases in referrals for eating disorders. And I think it links in with what people are saying about sort of people feeling a lack of control over their environment. We all felt out of control during lockdowns. There was a lot we couldn't control. And so young people, and I include young adults in that, have taken to trying to control their bodies, control their diet, control their weight shape. So we've had probably about a 40% increase in referrals for young people under 18s, and then for adults probably 20-25%, we're not sure. For young people, we have targets to see them within 4 weeks for an assessment and treatment, and we're largely 80 to 90% managing to do that still, which is remarkable. But I would say we absolutely need greater investment for adults with eating disorders, because what happens in my lifespan service is that if you're 17 3/4, you get seen within a week if you're urgent, or within 4 weeks if you're routine. And once you reach 18, we have a totally different picture. We have a year's waiting list for psychological therapy. And I just looked at my emails this morning to find that my last full-time therapist I have working, seeing adults for psychological therapy, has just gone on sick leave. Following, she's got long COVID. So, the other point I wanted to make was about this perfect storm of an increase in demand and a lack of resources in terms of treatment in the NHS. And I know lots of people are talking about supporting schools and things, but school teachers and counsellors in schools need training and supervision from NHS staff, and we have no NHS staff. I mean, it's just an absolute nightmare. It's worse than it's ever been, and we're really, really struggling to keep seeing people. So those are probably the two main things. Thank you very much.
Hello, Tina from Ditch to Live, one education coordinator, replacing our CEO Liam Hackett today. But I'm just really glad to be part of this discussion, because it's really at the core of all the values we have at Ditch Label. And actually, I've recently left teaching myself. I was teaching in a secondary school before taking on this role, and I can really testify to the fact that teachers are undertrained. They're in teacher training. There was no mandatory mental health training. I actually sought out a place to be for my own CPD because I felt that was really important for myself, but I wasn't necessarily pushed towards that by my schools that I was working in. And I can really empathise with the students that perhaps feel that the mental health support and wellbeing support they get in schools isn't sincere, because teachers are so overworked, and I do think they're doing the best they can, but teachers are so overworked that they aren't necessarily being able to give that all in delivering those resources. And I would say that the main thing that I personally would see a need for investment in is in pastoral teams as a whole. I think the teachers, as we say, are undertrained, and they are having many students come to them with quite severe mental health needs and not being adequately trained to help them with those on the spot between lessons when they're trying to deal with many other things that are going on. And I think that there are many staff that are taking on pastoral roles that are actually teaching staff as well, that aren't able to commit their time in supporting young people. So they need to know where to go when they need help at school. There needs to be designated people that they can go to and get the support in the moment they need it, rather than these 2 years of waiting lists. Obviously, we can't help that until there is investment in the NHS. But I think teachers are feeling that pressure of, there are these 2-year waiting lists for young people to get support. How do we support them when we're also under all this pressure post-pandemic? And I think the, in this idea of this epidemic that we're talking about of mental health, the anti-bullying survey that Digital Label runs annually in 2020 showed that 59% of young people said that the pressures that they feel in school is the main negative impact on their mental health. And post-pandemic, we haven't seen a slow transition back into school. What we've seen is we are pushing students through examinations day by day as fast as we can. And teachers themselves don't want to do that, but they are feeling this pressure from above to deliver that, and therefore, yes, they probably do come across insincere towards young people seeking support from them. So I'd say investment in pastoral teams is really important, but also that there are pastoral teams and mental health professionals that can support out of term as well. As we've seen in the pandemic, there's been a rise in need for mental health support. Our services at Digital Label and our online community, the demand increased by 158% during the lockdowns. So we can see that that's a need there, but it would also help then in terms of, this end of term need for those from, disadvantaged backgrounds that are then being left for a whole summer, perhaps, without the support that they are receiving in schools. So out of term support as well, I'd say, is a really important investment. And of course, increasing investigation in the data, such as the surveys that we do and the surveys that many other organisations are offering up, but perhaps aren't being taken on as an initiative nationwide to make sure that that data is being gathered so that we can make sure we're giving targeted support.
I think you're the fourth person, weren't you?
Thanks so much. Hi, it's Joe Lane from Action for Children. It's great to be, we're a general children's charity, so we're not completely focused on mental health, so it's great to hear from so many experts who are sort of dedicated. Action for Children, just very quickly, we help sort of hundreds of thousands of children and families every year, and that includes a couple of dedicated mental health services. 2 things I just wanted to chuck into the mix. So one is our sort of Blues program, which is our early intervention mental health service in schools. We've seen an increase in, I think the figure is from 41% to 49% of children taking the sort of screening survey are eligible for the program for counselling. So just another sort of data point on the evidence we've got on the increase in need. And our parental service, which is sort of like a child line for parents, basically, it's the sort of parents looking for mental health support for their children. It's the #1 issue that we see in one-to-one chats with family support workers. So them sort of, throwing up their hands and saying they don't know what to do. I think a few comments in terms of working like within the current policy environment sort of lead me to what our main ask would be. So one is we work with lots of mental health support teams, but it's too limited and it's not ambitious enough. It's not being rolled out quickly enough. They don't do quite enough. We don't think mental health support teams are sort of early enough. So it's that sort of reactive, has a child got a mental health problem, what can we put in place? So it's that well-being piece, what are we doing to boost well-being, boost resilience, improve children's ability to sort of, manage their own emotions. That I think those peer type of, programs are sort of really valuable for that. One really specific thing which like every mental health practitioner in our organisation tells me to raise is this sort of trauma gap, which is them as counsellors aren't trained or expert enough to deal with the sort of specific trauma-related care that lots of children need, but those children are almost never eligible for CAMS services. So lots of the children we work with, there's no onward referral, but the practitioner knows for sure that if they've had a trauma, they haven't got treatment for. So they just fill in the form and they say, well, they're not going to get accepted onto CAMS and I can't help them. And that's a sort of real like bleak reality that we see a lot. One like maybe problematic thing in this room, I really worry that we've got an over-reliance on schools in our thinking about children generally, but certainly children's mental health. So children spend, I think, between 15 and 25% of their time awake at school, and that's if things are going to plan. So yeah, you know, most of children's time is at home, or it's the weekend, or it's the holidays. They're not, you know, they're yeah.
They were asleep.
So most people aren't at school. Actually, they're with their friends or they're with their families. They're in their communities. So we need to be realistic about what schools can do. And somebody made the point, I think, about family support, family relationships being the #1 thing that is important for child mental health. And I would say our ask would be, you know, we don't have a children's strategy or a family strategy, and you know, whatever way you sort of dice the data, you know, whether it's sort of poverty measures, fuel poverty measures, whatever the sort of flavour of the month is in terms of the thing we're worried about, families with children inevitably come out at the bottom of the pile on that. You know, we haven't got a strategy for how do we make family life decent, whether it's maternity, the cost of childcare, you know, the benefit cap, 2-child limit. You know, we make living as a family really difficult. And I would say the thing that would make the biggest difference back to that point would be, you know, let's make being a family a positive choice that doesn't sort of damage people's lives. Yes, you know, there's lots of specific things that need to happen as well, but there needs to be sort of a plan for families that are going to improve children's well-being. But, you know,
I'll be brief as well, because I think we are coming to the end.
Yeah.
Hi everyone, I'm Tim Barker. I'm the CEO of COOF, with one of those organisations that's working on the edge of the sector to try and really improve things. We're the UK's largest digital mental health service. Our customers are NHS commissioners. 90% of commissioners in England commission us, 60% in Wales, about 30% in Scotland. 10.8 million people have got free access to mental health support. We were born in Manchester, so we've done a lot of work in Manchester over the 21 years that we've been around. During COVID, 1 in 10 of the school population used COOF. We had 1.1 million people use our service over that time. 60% of school kids have heard about COOF, 70% of teachers. And by providing a digital service, I just wanted to touch on some of the points that were made, because we're seeing some of the benefits of this already. So the first one is the incredible value of data. We have to move away from the environment where we are doing surveillance surveys every 2 to 3 years. We've got to take it from the world of Blockbuster to the world of Netflix, to use the analogy last week. So data and high frequency data is so valuable because it allows us to build a baseline that we can measure assessments to, we can identify interventions. In our own service, we're able to identify to commissioners incredibly early about the concerning rising eating difficulties, which we then saw months later fall onto waiting lists. So imagine a future where you can see the predictive power of that. You can identify that you will see a huge surge in acuity around this issue. If the biggest challenge we have is that we are not connected with other organizations. And so if there is a way to connect data, it also creates an incredibly compelling business case for the long term, because, you know, it's strong evidence. The second thing was just to touch on a couple of points around not putting everything on the shoulders of schools. So in our own service, 60% of school children use our service out of school hours. We're open till 10 PM, we're open at weekends. And so that really points to perhaps a bigger thing about giving choice. Children are prescribed to their whole life by adults. So giving people choice, whether that be, do you want professional support? Do you want peer support, which we also offer? Or do you just want kind of self-therapy type content? And what we see is when given choice, 60% of kids will choose like community peer support or self-therapy. 40% want and choose one-on-one support. The vast majority of those want drop-in support in the moment, perhaps needs some advice or support. We do a small amount of long-term care for individuals, and that's because we are focused primarily on early intervention. And the third part of it is perhaps just to talk about integration and collaboration. I really am so grateful to be invited today. And I do think we've got an opportunity in the ICS structure to take the kind of collaboration that we've done with Manchester over a long period of time and create these collaborative partnerships where we can connect our data, we can connect our ways of working, and we can give the whole population more choice and hopefully tackle inequality as part of that.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you very much to everybody who's contributed this afternoon. I've now got the dead simple task of making some rounding up closing remarks that bring all this together. But actually, I think it's been one of the most well-structured roundtables I have ever been asked to chair, that really an enormous amount of expertise in the room and an enormous amount of real life experience being brought into the room right now. I think there's a sense that we've absolutely got a moment going on here that we all know must be seized and captured if we're to really do right by children and young people for whom we all as adults bear responsibility. So I've sort of noted down what I think are the themes that have come out. Please feel afterwards that we want to continue this conversation and come back with more thoughts, and I know we'll also be producing, I hope we'll be producing some sort of note of what we've discussed today. I've picked up the importance of early intervention, very early intervention. Interestingly, we didn't talk much about early years today, but we did talk about families. I think we want to start right at the start. We've talked about preventative, not just response services. And I talked about the positive approach of promoting well-being, not treating this as a crisis that we've got to resolve, but actually starting from a culture of we want this to be good for everyone. Data, repeated comments about the need for good data, for sustained data, for shared data, for data that leads to action. I think that's really, really important point. A lot of discussion about the need for people who are providing mental health and wellbeing support, whether that's in school or elsewhere, having the training, the expertise, also the support for their own mental health and wellbeing, and also the places to refer on to when they can't provide the service that's needed. And of course, the vitally important need for investment and resources at every level of intervention and need. And we talked also about access, choice of access, and the different places and where we may be able to interact with children and young people. And I was very, very struck, I think perhaps paying into Kathy's autonomy point about the discussion we had around peer support. Children and young people are an asset in this conversation, not just a problem that we've got to resolve, or a bunch of needy people that it's our job to put right. I think thinking about where we might go next with this in terms of practical policy thinking, I thought John's question about devolution and how does that give us opportunities and new structures to work in, particularly for those of us thinking about a Greater Manchester context, but actually all over the country, whatever your model of local and regional governance, I think there's something really interesting to think about there. Integrated care services are a sort of immediate opportunity that we should think about. A lot of discussion about collaboration, education, to health, to third sector, to statutory services. How do we make those overlaps and relationships work? As I said, half laughingly, but I'm dead serious, the importance of ongoing high quality research, for which I'm really grateful that we've got academic partners who are thinking about this so carefully. And I'm really proud of the work that we've done in Greater Manchester with the Be Well initiative to really stress the importance of that sustained high quality research that translates into the policy actions and delivery mechanisms that are translated into the front line. And then finally, just underpinning all of this, the starting point for this meeting today was levelling up and addressing inequalities. And I think while we've not always been explicit about that in terms of what we've been discussing, it's implicit in everything that we have talked about. And that is something that I think as we go through further events in this thought leadership series, we'll really want to keep coming back to. But the absolute message for us, I think, is that we see this as not a single problem to be solved, but the need for a holistic, proactive strategy and commitment from government, from practitioners, from everybody who interacts with children and young people's lives. And I think we've been incredibly lucky today to have such excellent input, both from our presenters and from all of you as participants. So big thanks to Thought Manchester, Policy at Manchester, Thought Leadership. Big thanks to Diva Connect for putting it together for us, and thank you all for coming this along and contributing to the discussion today. Thank you all very much.
So,
Chair, just to say, we will be doing more, and I think one that sort of ties into this would be the health inequalities as well. So looking at that, but really well done.
Thank you. And others on the call.
Thank you very much.
Better soon.
You too.